Almost immediately after Henry VIII caught sight of a portrait of the mysterious Anne of Cleves, he decided to make her his wife. However, upon their first meeting, his spirits plummeted. He found her unbelievably unattractive, or so he claimed, and she is now notoriously known as Henry's rejected queen. Yet contemporary historians propose a more unsettling motive for his revulsion. The complete narrative is coming up. Renowned for his numerous marriages and their various outcomes, Henry VIII nearly plunged England into chaos in his relentless pursuit of a male heir. Henry VIII was not originally destined to be king. His elder brother Arthur was the successor to the throne. Suddenly, Henry the Backup became the heir to the English throne. On April 21, 1509, Henry Tudor succumbed to tuberculosis, and at just 17, Henry VIII ascended to the throne. Ironically, one of his initial actions was to marry his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon. Soon after their wedding, Henry and Catherine conceived a child. The couple was overjoyed, but 9 months later, grief replaced their happiness. The child was stillborn, leaving them inconsolable. A few months after the miscarriage, Catherine became pregnant again. This time she gave birth to a boy, but Henry and Catherine's first son, also named Henry, died 7 months after his birth. Following this, 2 more stillbirths occurred. A dark shadow began to loom over the royal household, and the relationship between Henry and Catherine became increasingly strained. Even the birth of a healthy child, Princess Mary, in 1516 could not salvage their bond. Henry blamed his wife Catherine for his lack of a male heir and the growing unrest in his kingdom. It wasn't long before Henry started taking mistresses. He pursued various wealthy and prominent women, but his most famous mistress was Bessie Blount, the daughter of a minor politician. In 1519, Bessie Blount gave birth to Henry's son and named him Henry Fitzroy after his father. Typically, if a king fathered an illegitimate child, they would never acknowledge it, but not Henry VIII. In a move that stunned the nation, Henry openly recognized the boy as his own. People were perplexed, but Henry had his reasons. Before Henry Fitzroy's arrival, people were beginning to question the king. He had been married for a decade and still lacked a male heir. In medieval thinking, this might suggest an issue with Henry's masculinity. In his view, this illegitimate son was proof that he was a real man and that the absence of an heir was solely his wife's fault. Henry faced 3 options: somehow legitimize Henry Fitzroy, marry off his daughter quickly and hope for a grandson, or place the blame on Catherine, discard her, and find someone new. The third option was arguably the most complicated and certainly the cruelest: Henry obtaining a young, attractive new wife. We all know which path he chose. So how did Henry select his next wife? Simple, he was already involved with the beautiful Mary Boleyn. Thus, Henry made the obvious choice, Mary's younger sister, Anne. However, he would soon discover that Anne Boleyn was not an easy conquest. Anne was young, intelligent, charismatic, and completely uninterested in becoming just another of Henry's flings. Despite the unflattering portraits from his later years, Henry was actually quite handsome in his youth. He was tall, athletic, and incredibly charming. Women easily succumbed to his allure. So while Anne Boleyn initially resisted, she eventually fell into Henry's embrace. Henry decided to leave Catherine of Aragon for Anne Boleyn, but there was a significant obstacle: the church. The Pope was not enthusiastic about the idea of a divorce. Henry attempted to persuade Pope Clement VII that his marriage to Catherine was invalid, but the pontiff was unconvinced. If the king was determined to get a divorce, he would have to do it without the church's consent. Ironically, up to this point, Henry had been an exceptionally devout Catholic. He had done much for the church, and they revered him for it, but nothing would deter him from getting what he desired. Perhaps if Henry had simply ignored the Pope, divorced Catherine, married Anne, and left it at that, things would have been temporarily awkward but eventually settled. However, that is not what Henry did. He escalated matters significantly. First, he established the Church of England and appointed himself as its head. Then, he enacted the Act of Restraint of Appeals, which essentially declared that Rome had no authority in English religious matters from that point forward. The Pope could no longer disregard Henry's actions. He officially excommunicated Henry, and the separation between the Catholic Church and the Church of England became final. Henry married Anne Boleyn and impregnated her even before his separation from Catherine of Aragon was officially finalized. He had spent a quarter of a century waiting for a son and was finished wasting time. Less than 9 months after their official marriage, Henry and Anne welcomed a daughter. Henry named her Elizabeth after his mother, Elizabeth of York, but he couldn't conceal his disappointment. After all that effort, he was still stuck with another daughter, and there was another issue in their marriage. Henry, who had found the stunning Anne Boleyn irresistible when he couldn't have her, discovered that married life with her was a different story. Anne was stubborn, independent, and had a volatile temper, a far cry from the docile trophy wife he desired, and things continued to worsen from there. The birth of Princess Elizabeth was a major letdown for Henry. Anne became pregnant again soon after, but if Elizabeth was disappointing, this next pregnancy was a disaster. Anne had a miscarriage in 1534, and Henry was not pleased. Anne Boleyn wasn't exactly thrilled with her marriage either, but she was astute enough to know that angering Henry was not in her best interest. She was desperate to give him a son, and some believed she was willing to do anything to achieve it. Many in England didn't believe that Anne had actually had a miscarriage. Instead, they claimed she fabricated the entire pregnancy, and her sister Mary was still causing considerable trouble. Mary Boleyn had fallen in love with a common soldier and secretly married him. This eliminated any possibility of Henry using her in a political alliance. Both he and Anne were furious, and they made Mary suffer severely. Henry and Anne banished Mary from court permanently. Mary went from a life of luxury to complete obscurity overnight. She never saw her sister again and died a few years later, completely forgotten. In early 1536, Anne Boleyn was pregnant yet again, aware that if the child was not a son, her days were numbered. Then, during a jousting tournament, a rival unseated Henry from his horse, leaving him seriously injured. When Anne heard about Henry's accident, it shocked her so profoundly that she suffered another miscarriage. And to add insult to injury, doctors revealed that the child had been a boy who could have saved the queen. Even though his wife recovered from her miscarriage, Henry was clearly finished with her. First, he began refusing to grant political positions to her family. Then, in an unprecedented move, he relocated his newest mistress, the 28-year-old Jane Seymour, into lavish new quarters in his palace. In the spring of 1536, Henry had Anne, her brother, and 4 other men imprisoned in the Tower of London. The courts accused each of the men, including her own brother, of having sexual relations with the queen, an act of treason. Henry also accused Anne of adultery, along with witchcraft, for good measure. There was virtually no evidence for any of these accusations. The men were executed on May 17th, and Anne, the Queen of England, was beheaded 2 days later. The 45-year-old Henry VIII became engaged to the almost 20 years younger Jane Seymour the day after Anne Boleyn's execution. Their marriage took place only 10 days later. For any other king, this would have been an unimaginable scandal. But for Henry, it was essentially business as usual. Henry IV's marriage to Jane Seymour began in the best possible way. On October 12, 1537, Seymour gave birth to a boy. The birth of Prince Edward finally signified an end to the turmoil. However, tragedy struck less than 2 weeks later, plunging Henry's court into disarray once more. Jane Seymour had access to the finest doctors in England, but it was 1537 and medicine still had a long way to progress. Edward's birth was agonizing, and the Queen suffered a severe infection. The doctors proved helpless, and Henry had to witness his beloved wife, the first to give him a healthy son, fade away. Jane Seymour succumbed to her infection on October 24th. Henry was heartbroken, but in a way he had obtained what he wanted. During her excruciating labor, doctors had informed the king that it might come down to saving either the child or the queen. Henry's response was utterly cold-blooded. If you cannot save both, at least let the child live, for other wives are easily found. Jane Seymour's death marked a transformation in Henry VIII. He began to become morbidly obese and started suffering from diabetes and gout. His mood darkened further, and he became paranoid and irrational. There were few people left whom Henry trusted, but one of them was his devious spy master, Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell was one of the most influential men in England until he suggested Henry marry the 25-year-old German Duchess, Anne of Cleves. It seemed like an ideal match, and Anne's father could prove to be a crucial ally if religious war were to erupt. There was only one problem. Political marriages were advantageous, but Henry was not about to marry someone he had never even seen. What if she was unattractive? But not to worry, Cromwell had the perfect solution. He dispatched one of the most skilled portrait artists in the world to paint Anne so Henry could assess her for himself. When the painting finally reached him, along with Thomas Cromwell's assurances that Anne was essentially his dream woman, Henry was ultimately convinced. Reportedly, when they actually met, Henry VIII took one look at Anne of Cleves and realized he had made a terrible mistake. Whether it was her appearance or her personality, Henry was already seeking an escape before they had even officially married. The marriage lasted a mere 6 months, and according to Henry, it was never consummated. Henry annulled his marriage to Anne of Cleves and granted her the title of the King's Sister. Thanks to this peculiar title, Anne would become one of the rare wives who actually outlived Henry VIII. Anne of Cleves simply didn't appeal to the now 46-year-old Henry, but you know who did? The 17-year-old Catherine Howard. Apparently, Henry realized that political marriages were not for him and reverted to marrying whoever he was attracted to. However, not everyone was pleased with this latest match. Thomas Cromwell orchestrated the Anne of Cleves match only to witness it fall apart almost immediately. Then, to make matters worse, Henry began pursuing Catherine Howard, who was the niece of the Duke of Norfolk, one of Cromwell's biggest political rivals. Suddenly, Cromwell began to feel trapped. In the end, Henry charged Cromwell with treason and a host of other fabricated accusations. Despite everything he had done for Henry, Cromwell met the same fate as everyone else who stood in the murderous king's way. Henry didn't even bother to attend the execution. He was busy getting married for the 5th time. He married Catherine Howard on the very same day. The timing of the nuptials even allowed Henry to give his wife a particularly generous wedding present. He bestowed upon his new queen all of Thomas Cromwell's lands. It's not as if he was using them anymore. Almost as soon as she married Henry, Catherine began an affair with one of his courtiers, a man named Thomas Culpeper. Since there were no secrets in a royal palace, news of the affair soon reached the king. This time, however, it seems as though Henry was deeply in love in a way he hadn't been in years. He refused to believe the rumors and stood by his queen. Before she was queen, Catherine Howard had had an affair with another Tudor courtier, Francis Derham. Strangely, Howard hired Derham to work for her when she married Henry. Not the wisest decision. Derham confessed to having had an affair with Catherine in the past. But even worse, he revealed her relationship with Culpeper. Finally, Henry had to acknowledge the truth. After years of cheating on his wives, this time, the tables had turned. But Catherine Howard did not go down without a fight. When officials questioned her about Derham's claims, she insisted she never cared for him and that he had forced her into an adulterous relationship against her will. Henry charged Catherine, Derham, and Culpeper with treason and sentenced them to beheading. Of course, Catherine Howard did not receive the news well. The 19-year-old queen allegedly broke free from her guards and ran through the halls screaming for Henry to show her mercy. She never reached him, however. In fact, she would never see the king again. On October 13, 1542, Henry had Catherine and both men beheaded. That makes 5 wives down, 2 of them by Henry's own hand. When it came to women, Henry VIII simply couldn't control himself. In July 1543, Henry VIII married for the last time. His latest bride was Catherine Parr, and she couldn't have been more different from Henry's previous wives. First of all, she was almost age-appropriate at 31 years old. She was also remarkably stable compared to his previous wives. There were no wild cheating scandals or whispered rumors. In fact, Catherine Parr managed to accomplish something none of Henry's other wives ever did. She made a somewhat decent man out of him. Years earlier, Henry had removed his 2 daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, from the line of succession. They spent the subsequent years in a tense limbo. Parr convinced Henry to reconcile with his 2 daughters, and he finally reinstated them into the line of succession. So essentially, without Catherine Parr, England would have missed out on Queen Elizabeth II, one of its greatest monarchs ever. While the young Henry VIII had been attractive and athletic, the older Henry was a different story altogether. By this point, his waist had expanded to 54 inches, and he could barely even walk. He needed attendants to wheel him around wherever he went. The worst part was the gout, which left him covered in excruciating pus-filled boils. Mercifully, Henry VIII died of an illness related to his obesity at the age of 55. With that, Catherine Parr and Anne of Cleves could at least claim they were the only wives to outlive the murderous king. In a surprising request, Henry asked his attendants to bury him next to Jane Seymour. After all of his wives, he wanted to rest beside the only wife who gave him a son. Ever wondered what happened to Henry Fitzroy, the illegitimate son who caused such a stir in Henry's younger days? It turns out he lived through more scandals than just his birth. Back before Henry had a legitimate heir, he strongly considered legitimizing Fitzroy. This is when a cardinal proposed a twisted solution to the king's succession problems. Marry Fitzroy to his half-sister Mary, Henry, and Catherine of Aragon's daughter Mary. In the end, they did not proceed with it. Henry VIII did many seriously messed up things, but thankfully, forcing his son and daughter to marry each other was not one of them. Anne of Cleves is now notorious as Henry's rejected queen, but was it really as simple as Henry found her unattractive and cast her aside? Modern historians suggest a very different reason for his disgust. On their way to London to meet the king, Anne's party stopped at Rochester. Suddenly, an old burly stranger entered her room, and everything went horribly wrong. You see, this stranger was actually Henry VIII in disguise. He had wanted to sneak in and get a preview of his new bride-to-be. He also anticipated that she would recognize him despite his costume. Spoiler alert, this was not a good idea. Depending on the account, either Henry tried to get Anne's attention and she ignored him, or he outright tried to kiss her, which understandably horrified the young woman. Either way, it was a disaster, and Henry left the encounter angry, embarrassed, and possibly seeking revenge. In the end, the most notorious of Henry's discarded wives was Anne Boleyn, but her end was even more tragic than people realize. After 4 days in the Tower of London, Boleyn gave a letter to her guard. It was addressed to Henry. In it, she pleaded for mercy, writing that never prince had wife more loyal in all duty and in all true affection than you have ever found in Anne Boleyn. She also made one final heartbreaking request. Boleyn begged him to think of their daughter Elizabeth, and then she humbly asked Henry to spare the lives of her brother and the other men accused of being her lovers. At her core, until the very end, Boleyn was truly selfless. But as we know, it didn't go her way. She never stood a chance. Unfortunately, she married Henry VIII, England's most murderous king. His relentless quest for a male heir led to seismic shifts, most notably the establishment of the Church of England, which forever altered the religious landscape of the nation. Henry's reign was characterized by both brilliance and brutality, as he ruthlessly eliminated those who stood in his way, be they wives, advisors, or friends. The king's physical and emotional transformation over the years reflected his deteriorating health and deepening paranoia. Once a handsome, charismatic ruler, he became a bloated and temperamental autocrat, prone to rash decisions that had dire consequences for those in his orbit. His wives, particularly Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, met tragic fates sacrificed to his ambitions and insecurities. Even his trusted confidants, such as Thomas Cromwell, learned that loyalty to Henry could be fleeting when their usefulness came to an end. Anne of Cleves, often dismissed as the rejected queen, was one of the few who navigated the treacherous waters of Henry's court and survived. Her ability to accept the annulment with grace allowed her to secure a comfortable position as the king's sister, ensuring her safety and financial stability. In contrast, the young and naive Catherine Howard suffered a gruesome fate, executed for her indiscretions, just as Anne Boleyn had been. These patterns of marriage, betrayal, and execution underscored Henry's volatility and the precarious nature of life at court. Despite his many marriages, only one of his children, Edward VI, fulfilled his primary goal of securing a male heir. However, Edward's short reign, followed by the tumultuous rules of Mary Warren and Elizabeth I, demonstrated that Henry's obsession with a son was ultimately misplaced. Ironically, it was his daughter Elizabeth who became one of England's greatest monarchs, proving that the legacy Henry sought did not depend solely on gender. By the time of his death in 1547, Henry had left a kingdom forever changed, a court filled with ghosts of those who had fallen victim to his ambitions, and a legacy that continues to fascinate the world centuries later. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please like and subscribe.